I start off a live stream on YouTube because my Samsung laptop, and whenever I try to put the computer in live stream mode or whatever, it automatically defaults to the camera on the keyboard, which faces up towards the ceiling. It automatically makes my blood pressure go to like 150 and my anger level go to 11. Because I realize that everything, whether it is a laptop or a phone or a new car, has what I call a garbage element, an element that matters, it's very important, that just doesn't work right. So in order to make it possible for me to live stream, I have to select back camera, then reselect front camera, and then wave at it and see if it's picking up my face or if it's picking up my ceiling, which is really, really frustrating. Maybe this is a good segue. I decided to do a live stream this morning to celebrate and talk about what it's been like to service Classic Mercedes for 15 years. In May of 2006, I opened my shop in the woods in East Orlando before it was like rampantly overdeveloped. And I began to service Mercedes in a 500 square foot building with a concrete floor and a roof, which is nice. It was a steel building, so it was very sturdy, but there were a couple of downsides. And one of them was that there was a live electric current that would always run through the building, so I was always trying to be really careful about getting shocked. I remember approaching the building in the rain one day and trying to unlock the padlock on the back door to get in, and I had to use a plastic bag over my hand, a pair of insulated screwdrivers, and a pair of insulated pliers, and sometimes I had to use a voltmeter. I'd always carry a voltmeter with me and ground one end on my hand and ground the other one on the building, and if the voltmeter gave me voltage, then I knew that I was going to get shocked if I touched the building. So I sort of learned to protect myself. My landlord at the time thought that running a cable, a ground cable, into the ground would have resolved the problem, but in reality, it was because there was a live wire that was somehow energizing the entire building through the circuit breaker box. And yeah, I don't know. I hope that got resolved, but he seemed to like getting electrocuted by the building. I don't know. So I made this stream today to reflect on what it would like to do this for 15 years, whether I like it or not, whether I could still continue to do it, what it's going to be like for me, in the future, what my aspirations are. Maybe I made this more for myself than anybody else. But when I started doing this, the first real car that somebody brought to me, the first car that mattered, was a 300 SEL 4.5 that belonged to a man named Dr. Alzamora, and he had bought this car new, and nobody wanted to work on the air suspension. So I took on the task of working on the air suspension. At the time, I was able to get new valves from Mercedes, and I was able to repair the suspension in the car, and that started a lifetime relationship with me and Dr. Alzamora. Dr. Alzamora passed on last year at the age of 94, and his grandson now owns the car, who's an attorney and, smart guy, very hopefully prepared to take on the work of owning a 300 SEL 4.5, but it's nice to know that I'm still involved in this car's life. Something bad didn't happen to it, which to me, tells me that I did something that mattered if one considers making sure that a Mercedes survives over a few more generations, something that really matters. So the big question is then, how do we measure our successes versus our failures? I've had a lot of ugly failures over the years because we all have ugly failures. I mean, it's just part of the process of life. I think that when I first started, I knew that when I was 21, when I started the shop, I knew that the next 5 years were going to be very difficult because the scope of knowledge that I did not have greatly outweighed the fact, the actual information that I knew and I was aware of. So let's say I had 15% of the knowledge I needed to work on these cars properly, but I was missing 85% of that knowledge. So to bridge the knowledge gap, I knew that it was going to not take me months or days, but years of total immersion. And totally immersing yourself in something it's a big commitment, especially when you don't know where you're going to come out. For the first year I did this, I drove a 1969 220D. It was rusting to pieces, but it was very reliable. I put 100 miles or more a day on this car. I drove from my house in Rockledge 34 miles to my shop. And then I'd often drive like another 25 miles on top of that to German Parts World to pick up parts because the UPS would not deliver to a farm off of some dirt road. That was just how it was. When I got that car when I was in college, I did not realize how much I was going to depend on it. But again, in retrospective, for a car that cost $150 and maintaining it on a shoestring budget, like I would change the oil every 3,000 miles and adjust the valves and make sure the belts were okay. It was a very simple car, by the way. Nothing major ever broke. I may have had to change a hood cable and a speedometer, cable or something, different points of owning the car. But overall, it was a very sound car until a ball joint broke, and I fixed the ball joint and drove the car again for another 6 months, but I realized it was so rusty. I kept losing phones through the hole in the floorboard out of my left pocket. To give you an idea, it happened twice. It was just a really challenging car to own because it was devoid of any creature comforts. So anyway, going back to the daily struggle, the first struggle was getting to work. I didn't really have a room at my parents' house. My parents had a small house, and at the time, all three of my siblings lived at home. So I'd lived away during college. Actually, my brother didn't at the time. That's right. I'd lived away during college in Orlando, but, when you're starting your own business, there's never any extra money. And I thought to myself, better that I do this at 21 than doing this at 28. And I used to wonder, oh, am I going to meet a girl and have a girlfriend and this and that and blah, blah, blah at 21, like most simpy 21-year-olds do. But at the time, I guess it was better that I had close personal relationships with people, but I didn't have a love interest, or at least one that was mutually interested. And so I didn't realize it at the time, but this freed me up to be able to do things with my time and my energy that most people just don't do. So I would get very angry and frustrated and upset during this period of time when I was working on cars that I didn't understand very well. I remember the first major job I taught myself how to do, which was rebuilding the front suspensions in 123 and 126 cars. I said, this is an obvious need. Most of these cars have worn out front suspensions. Most of the time, when they need to have their front end rebuilt. When they need to have their front end rebuilt, nobody has the tools to do it. So I bought all of the tools that I needed and taught myself how to do this job. I had this customer named Charlie Brown, I kid you not, and Charlie took great care of me. He was probably one of the best customers I've ever had. I think he moved back to Oklahoma a few years ago, but at one point he ended up selling all of his Mercedes. I still service 2 of his old cars, actually, which is great, but one of them is not in the best shape. Oh, well. I rebuilt the front end on his 84 300 SD that he used all day, every day. I learned to do lower ball joints in like 2.5 hours, and I would come in at night and do lower ball joints. Everything else was pretty much cut and dry except for lower control arm bushings. But I would come in and work through my frustration and my anger about so many things during early hours of the morning. And so the next thing that happened was that, sorry about the phone, by the way, that's one of my subscribers calling. He's about to buy a 500 SEL. So big round of applause to you, Hayden, for taking on this really neat car. The next thing that I really started to wrap my head around was that maybe I could fully sort out a 123 series car. And so an early failure that I had was I had a customer that brought me a 300D. It was a very nice car. It was champagne. I worked on this car. I did the front suspension on it, climate control parts, AC compressor, belts, all this stuff on the car. So I was learning, at least on the cars that I really liked. But when I was almost done with the car, I took it on a long test drive and I got into a car accident. And this car accident not only injured me because I was on the 408 and I fell asleep at the wheel, and some guy made a complete stop in front of me because I guess he was looking for insurance money, and I rear-ended him. I didn't know what to do. I don't know why the guy stopped. He was in a Nissan Armada, and this is 2008. He was in like a brand new Nissan Armada. He just totally stopped. There was nobody on the 408. No one. And boom, I just hit him. Well, after that, I had to fix the car. And everybody who tried to fix the car for me did a horrible job. And they ripped me off. I mean, I didn't have any money at the time, and I was constantly getting bankrupted by these assholes in the collision industry. So if you ask me how I feel about collision shops and car painters nowadays, it's usually not good. I don't like any of them. I think that there are very few painters I've met that are really impressive. There are very few metal workers that I've met that are really impressive. But I don't think that it's a good idea for anybody to test drive a car late at night. I mean, I was burning the candle at both ends, unfortunately, because I had such a desire to learn, and I took on so much responsibility early on. I said, if I take on all this responsibility and sort of force myself to acquire knowledge, then I will acquire knowledge. And it worked. I did acquire a lot of knowledge, but it came at a hefty price. I gained a lot of weight from eating Taco Bell at 1 o'clock in the morning. I was already going through a lot of pain because of my car accident. I started to have lower back pain. I didn't really sleep very much. I slept when I could. Sometimes I'd sleep all night at the shop. Sometimes I'd sleep in the back of my 220D. I think probably the 2 best things in my life at this point in time were my friend Joe Bianco, who's still, a close friend. I still talk to Joe as often as I can. He has 2 kids, and he has an 84 280 SL. Joe and I kind of figured it out together on our own separate paths. And then my friend Caroline Law, who I haven't talked to in years. Caroline just disappeared and ghosted me one day, which was really sad because she and I were just, I don't know. She and I were both good friends, I guess. We were both different. We thought out of the box about everything. But I used to go to Lakeland and visit her and her friends, her goofy friends, and we do things like freestyle rap or hold open mic concerts in the lobby at the dorms at Florida Southern College. So those are the golden days. I mean, I remember driving, down I-4 at 3 o'clock in the morning coming back from Lakeland. I'd see a rest stop. I'd go take a nap if I was tired. I'd actually, I don't know. I mean, it was kind of fun living hand to mouth, not knowing if you were going to have money one day or the next. I think the redeeming factor of the 220D was that it got great fuel economy, but it was a challenging car to drive on the highway. The constant ringing in my ears from no floors and a broken exhaust. One morning I got into an accident with that car and it ended up folding the rear left quarter panel and breaking the exhaust. So it always smelled like diesel exhaust. And the trunk never closed right, even after I beat out the quarter panel. I mean, it was so rusty back there. What was going to happen? So here I am driving this car that's falling apart, trying to make ends meet, trying to have like a meaningful personal life. At the time, I still am, but in a different way. At the time, I was I think I would say that I was probably more religious than, maybe not so much than I am now. I'm just saying it's a different flavor. But I was still involved with the UCF's Catholic campus ministry. So I had a lot of friends there, but people would look at me funny because at the time I had dreadlocks and I liked to go barefoot. And I didn't really have any nice clothes. Most of my clothes came from thrift stores. I had a far different taste in music than a lot of the church kids. And people would look at me and they'd be like, "Are you okay? Is everything okay?" I was almost like a hermit, sort of living in the woods in an orange grove, working on Mercedes, spending a lot of time by myself, sorting out a myriad of problems that I didn't have a complete understanding of. And I was trying to work my way through issues or problems that a lot of mechanics didn't want to resolve. And here I am, basically like a clueless 21/22-year-old. And I don't know. I always had this weird feeling when I would feel defeated that something was wrong with me, but that I would eventually work through it or find a workaround. And so the answer came to me when I was driving my buddy Chris's 280 SL, which is another important car that's entrusted with, around Cocoa Village when it wouldn't run right. And then I cleaned off the ignition points, or tried to, and the car shut off. Then I opened the cap and I cleaned them off again. And then I was like, oh my gosh, ignition points. This is why gasoline engines don't always run well, older gasoline engines. So I began to develop an understanding of ignition systems at that point. There was another time where my dad had to help me when he was still alive. I had a customer with a 380 SL and he had a broken upper left chain guide. And for the life of me, I could not get the chain guide out of the car. I screwed up everything, but I managed to finally get it out. And then it dawned on me that timing chain guides in those cars do like to break and cause a chain to jump. So then I acquired a 380 SL with my buddy Dave and learned about cylinder heads. I pulled the heads off one head off because the valves on the left side were bent. I pulled the oil pan and the front timing cover. I did all that stuff. I pulled all of it apart and fixed a broken distributor timing gear and changed like the oil pan gasket and everything. I mean, I had to pull the front subframe out of the car to get the oil pan off. This is a lot of work for a 22-year-old. But did the car ever run right? Well, sort of. It didn't run badly, but it had a really nasty idle until right when I sold the car and I learned about the CO2 adjustment on the fuel distributor. And after I adjusted it there, it worked really good. Now, a major failure I had at the time, I had a friend named Taylor Wyatt, and her dad, who was a pastor, at a 420 SEL. And I was trying to change the valve stem seals in the 420 SEL, and I was using the wrong tool, and I ended up bending and then straightening one of the valves. Well, that didn't work. I had to pull one of the heads off in the car. And so it goes, I felt like the car never ran quite right after that. It was always underpowered and always ran rough. Maybe the timing was off. Who knows? I honestly didn't know what to do. I didn't have a clue about what I had done wrong, which was really frustrating for me because otherwise it was a nice car. Then there was another situation that I had where I had a 190 E2.6 that belonged to Joan Lopez, and Joan is still one of my customers today. She's wonderful. Her and her husband have always taken great care of me. She had a 190 E2.6 with a blown head gasket. And that was the first time I did a head gasket on an M103 engine. I changed the valve stem seals while the head was off, but I had no head work done. She also had a 300 SDL where she damaged the bottom end of the engine. Not that it was her fault. The vacuum pump failed, sucked up bearings into the oil pump, broke the oil pump, and caused the engine to starve for oil. I didn't realize this, but at the time, a good machinist was the most important, gun in my sling, I don't know, or arrow in my quiver. And that was how I met Jim, my machinist, at 22 years old. Again, I was still at the shop in Avalon Park. Jim and I first spoke about this 300 SDL, and ultimately, because it had some other issues, the customer elected not to fix it. But I made a very important connection, and so I still work with the Jim today. And it's funny because he still looks the same, acts the same. He's still kind of the same person. It's just funny because I realized that I wouldn't have been able to accomplish very much without a good machinist, without that resource. So the next step in my plan when I was starting to work on these cars was, that I needed to figure out a way to expand my business. So I was learning a little bit. I felt like I was learning. I learned about injection pump timing on an 83 300 DIO that kept jamming its pump. It had a bad injection pump. I didn't realize it, but I learned everything, including about the keyway and the injection pump timer. Changing that keyway is horrible. It's a horrible job. It sucks. Miserable job. I remember pulling the thermostat housing over and over again. I remember trying to do the last drop drip test or whatever. And the car would run well for a while, and the pump would seize. It was just a very frustrating thing. So what we ended up doing, or what I ended up doing, was moving slowly towards doing on-site service for people. I'd come to their houses and work on their cars sometimes, or I'd drop my car off and pick their car up. But my landlord started to develop some issues, and this was at a point where he had a serious drug addiction problem. He was using Percocet. He was taking 5 Percocet a day. And so my relationship with him was starting to deteriorate. His wife at the time also had some issues. They were really starting to make life difficult for me. And after this point in time, I realized that I had to get out of that shop. And so Nick tried all kinds of dirty tactics against me because he wasn't thinking right. He sent a guy who I think was also a drug addict who used to work for the FBI over to the shop, who threatened me with a firearm. And after talking to this guy and explaining to him what had happened between Nick and I, he didn't show me a gun, but he claimed he had one. And when somebody claims you have one and you're off in the woods, that's how people get murdered, and nothing gets resolved. Nobody ever finds out who did it. I mean, I had never seen this guy or heard of this guy before. All I knew was that he was friends with Nick Viola. And I guess he was there to take me out. I'm not sure. But when Nick got back and he saw that this guy had not murdered me for some reason, because I guess Nick was in a Percocet-induced stupor. He got so angry that he cut a live electric wire with his pocket knife. He literally held the metal pocket knife and cut through a live electric wire. And I'm pretty sure he almost got himself electrocuted, but that didn't work. He tried increasing the current in the building. And finally, one day when I was leaving my shop, he tried to ram me with his carpet cleaning truck. So imagine being in a 220D, which is not a fast car, and you have a head-on 8,000-pound Ford van coming at you loaded with carpet cleaning equipment. What do? Well, I waited until the last minute, and then I swerved out of the way off the road and got back on the road. And Nick just sort of touched my damaged rear left quarter panel. I felt it, but I managed to get by him, thank God. And then he chased me down in traffic. He chased me down in traffic because he couldn't get to me with his van. He started beating on my windows. And I don't know. I went to the police. They didn't do anything. Police don't do anything. So I had to repatriate all of my stuff. My buddy Tex helped me. We came over in his 240D. And Tex stood there in the driveway touting a weapon, Desert Eagle, and walking the driveway, making sure this is a long dirt driveway, making sure that Nick didn't come back while I managed to get all my tools. So things, I guess, didn't go that well for Nick. I think he got clean. Unfortunately, his wife passed away from a drug overdose years later. They even invited me to the funeral. I don't know. I mean, Nick came to visit me and apologize after he got clean, but I told him, I said, when you try to kill somebody, there's not really, I can forgive you, but I shouldn't have a relationship with you because I know that you're not a normal, healthy, balanced person. And so that was that. I worked out of my 220D for about a month, and then I started praying about it, and the Holy Spirit led me to Titusville, Florida. Not joking. I think that sometimes, God leads people places. So I found this shop that I could afford. It was just, a small shop, 650 square feet, but I could fit 3 cars in there and a workbench. And I started working on cars in Titusville. And so my customer base started to grow incrementally, just a little bit at a time. Now, granted, this is 08, so we were in the middle of a recession. But I could still figure out a way to grow the business in a recession, so I was able to rent a slightly bigger unit a few months later. I moved to the small unit in April of 2008, about the time that I finished wrecking the 300D and then fixing it. And then after in April, I stuck it out in the smaller shop until I think it was October of 2008. So that was 13 years ago when I moved into the end bay at 1000 Pine Street. And then 8 years later in 2016, I moved into the bigger bay on at the end of my shop on Pine Street again at 1014. So I didn't do much moving from 2008 to 2021. 13 years, didn't move a whole lot. But we took on some monumental projects. So as a funny aside, I used to try to save money wherever possible. And I went to this Walmart in Titusville to buy distilled water for the cooling system. So I'd sit there balancing Xerox Go5 with distilled water, trying to get a perfect 50-50 ratio. And there was this girl that worked there that I would always talk to. Everybody has like a cashier they talk to, but she is really pretty. She was like 18 and I was 22 at the time. And I didn't realize this, but like she had just gotten married. And so I used to flirt with her. And all the time I'd talk to her and I'd say, "Oh, how are you doing?" Blah, blah, blah. I can't remember her name, but we would converse. And finally I asked her, I said, "Do you want to go do something one day?" And she's like, what do you mean? I was like, I don't know, like go out one day or something. And she looked at me and she's like, I'm married. She holds up a ring and I didn't know what else to say. I said, oh, that ring? I said, I thought that was like something from a bubblegum vending machine or something. And she was like, no, it's my wedding ring. I was like, I'm sorry. I didn't know. And that was that. But sometimes I can't help but be brutally honest with people. And so it literally looked like a, not like a gag ring or something, like not a real ring. I felt bad. I still feel bad about that. But, you know, at this time, like between '08 and 2010, I really wasn't making that much money. I mean, life was a perpetual struggle for me. And the perpetual struggle that was going on seemed to get worse when the 220D really just rusted to the point where I didn't feel comfortable using any days every day. So I had no car. At this point, I would drive customers' cars, or my mom would give me a ride to work or whatever. I didn't know. I mean, I was just like still struggling to make ends meet. I was uh, about $10,000 in debt with German Parts World at the time where I bought all my parts. I didn't have any savings at all. You know, it was just a very difficult time. And I was still trying to put dead cars back on the road. I became obsessed with this idea that I could save Mercedes from wrecking yards. So I used to go to wrecking yards with a little bit of cash. I used to try to buy these cars, and some of them I repatriated and put back on the road. A lot of them, like this, wasn't really long-term successful, but there were a few cars that made it. You know, I had started doing this when I was in college, and I kind of kept doing it. But the reality is that um, I didn't know how I was going to make ends meet during this period of time. And so my mom came in and helped me, and we came up with a better business plan because at the time there was something critical I wasn't doing. I was not charging any parts markup. So if I bought an oil filter for $5 and it took me, you know, break it down like $1.50 in fuel to drive out to German Parts World and get the oil filter. I By the way, John, I do have a psychology degree from the University of Central Florida. I do. And I got it fast too. I got it a year ahead of everybody else. But you're right. There are such things as useless degrees. And psychology can be one of them if you don't spend decades in school getting a PhD. Anyway, if I spent $1.50 getting that oil filter and I paid sales tax on the oil filter after I sold it, I was still selling it for $5. And that's not very good economics because I wasn't factoring my acquisition and storage costs into that part either. I also wasn't factoring my capital into it. So if I spend money going out and picking up the parts or having them shipped to my shop and I'm only selling them for the cost of purchase, I am going to slowly lose money. So my mom discovered that this was my major problem. So we raised my hourly rate. At the time, don't be surprised to hear this, but I started off working for $15 an hour, and then I went to 30, and then I went to 35, and then I went to 60, and I was freaking out because I said, if I charge $60 an hour, everybody's going to leave and they're going to think that I'm a crook. But actually, that was not what happened. I do think that when you're starting off doing something, charging a lower hourly rate might be a good introductory strategy. I think it worked for me. But the customers that I had then are not the same customers that I have now. The customers that I have now probably would have not wanted to be my customers back then. The customers that I had then would probably not all want to be my customers now, although some of them still are, which is great. And I appreciate all of you guys that have stuck with me through the years. I had a customer named Eric. Eric had a 113, and he asked me to do heater levers and some other repairs, things like a speedometer cable and brake repairs and adjusting the valves and his engine and some other things. So he ended up with a bill of about $2,000 for what amounted to 30 plus hours of work, and he just did not want to pay the bill. You know, he did not want to pay that bill. And that's when I started to learn that some customers are really mean and nasty, and they just want to exploit people because of, a lower labor rate. And so I maintained a relationship with this customer until he sold his car. But he and I had this kind of weird relationship where my mom, who was handling some of these accounts for me at the time, would explain to him that I needed to get paid or I couldn't pay my bills. And to him, that just didn't mean anything, I guess, because he had a cushy corporate job or whatever. And that's when I started to think, man, I could do anything. I could be working, I could go back to school and become a doctor. I could go become a surgeon, an attorney, an engineer, or something. Up until that point in time, I had not believed that I was smart enough to do advanced math or chemistry or biology, but I did start to build some self-confidence and think, maybe I can handle some more complicated stuff. I don't know why, but I chose to stick with it. Or do I know why? I'm not sure. At the time, I was heavily reliant on my dad for information. And so that was fine, but it was about to come to a crashing halt where I had to completely change my knowledge acquisition process. See, my knowledge acquisition process prior to this whole thing that I'm about to tell you about that happened with my dad was ask questions, and if you can't get an answer, just deadhead it until you find one. Just keep throwing resources, money, parts, and time at the problem until you find an answer. And this is an approach that I think a lot of mechanics take when they're younger. They find a person they can ask questions to. Well, at this point, I was starting to notice that my dad did not fully understand things like a compressor RPM sensor on an M103 engine, or how to adjust an electrohydraulic actuator. There were a lot of things that my dad was not fully versed in. At about this time, Graham Cookingham, who I still talk to a little bit, sent me his 190E 16 valve, and that's when I started to learn how KE Jetronic actually worked. His 190E 2.3 16 valve had no power over 40 miles an hour. And so I asked German Parts World, my buddy George Dillon, who is still selling Mercedes parts today, if he knew of anybody that could help me with K-Jet. So he put me in touch with Larry. Larry explained to me how to adjust EHA valves, how to set differential pressures. He rebuilt the fuel distributor for me on this 16 valve. And we were eventually able to get the car to not only perform well, but to outperform most other 16 valves. And it got like 30 miles per gallon, which was insane. But, again, a lot of this had been based on asking questions. At about this time, when I moved into the slightly bigger shop at 1000 Pine Street, and I was still struggling with debt or whatever. I was still really frustrated every day because I didn't really know how to make money. I was acquiring knowledge, but I did not know how to make money. I didn't really have a car. So my friend Joe Sola gave me his 1985 280 SEL that he didn't really drive anymore. And I worked very hard in that car to make it as good as it could be. And I used it for a long time until I sold it when the head gasket started to deteriorate. And I at this point was like, well, I've got a better car or whatever. At the time, I was about to get my 280 SE 4.5 in 2012, but that 280 SEL was the single greatest, best gift anybody'd given me. It was a great car, got us through some very difficult times. After a little bit of hard work, it turned out to be an amazing running car, and I was very grateful for it. I was very proud of that car. And it's kind of a shame. I think I probably should have kept it and just pulled the head on it and gotten the head repaired. But, by this time I was so busy trying to keep up with life that I didn't really know what else to do. There were a number of pivotal and important things that happened at this time. So this was that limelight period in 2009 and, beginning of 2010 that I really started to want to find myself more, not just stand there at night in my shop and contemplate, the universe or whatever. I had help at the time. His name was Tori Tran. Tori would come over and assist me with major projects. And we had a lot of fun together. He was very meticulous and very smart. I think he's very successful now. But at that time I started to understand the importance of mentorship. And Tori, I think, was like 18 at the time. So he and I did have a lot of fun together with the ins and outs of learning about these cars. But I wanted to see what some other things were like. And at the time, Jonathan, one of my customers, invited me to go on a documentary tour and hold a boom mic. And at the same time, this was 2009, I was invited to speak at StarTech in Indianapolis by Chuck Landenberger. And Chuck really believed in me. I miss Chuck a lot. He was a great guy. It proves that just because somebody's older and they're involved with the MBCA doesn't mean that they are not proactive. There are a lot of older people involved with MBCA that are really great, wonderful people. And so Chuck enrolled me in speaking at StarTech, and that was where I met my great friend and mentor, Bill Walsh, at that StarTech event because he drove his 300 SDL out there. And at the same time, I went on this road trip, 2 weeks, I had a love interest named Hannah Martin. Hannah and I don't really talk anymore, but Hannah was a great friend. She and I became like best buddies before we dated. We were like best friends for like a year and a half. I don't know, maybe she never considered it that way, but Hannah and I had more in common as people, I think, than we did necessarily physical attraction. It was more of like a situational awareness thing for me, that I wanted to be around somebody that, that was also in the process of self-discovery. And so we sort of engaged in this process together, she in her way and me in my own way. And as difficult as it was it's weird being in a relationship with somebody who's also going through the process of self-discovery, because sometimes the process of self-discovery gets very ugly and emotional. And during that period of time, everything seemed very fresh and exciting, but I also felt very trapped by a lot of circumstances. So I learned that I did not want to get married yet. And I also learned that I was really having a very difficult time wrapping my head around what it meant to be an adult. And when I got back from that trip, I talked to Hannah every day. Oh, what are you experiencing? What are you seeing? I got to see things that I'd never seen before. Like I went to Southampton. I got to see what rich people are like in fancy restaurants. Never seen that before in my life. I'd never been to, my idea of fine dining was going to Olive Garden. I'm not joking at all. That was really the truth about how I saw everything. I had come from a background where every penny was scrimped and saved, and where the finer things in life were not, like, they were just forbidden. Probably a good thing, and I'm thankful for it. But I feel bad for my dad because he never really experienced anything like that. I was exposed to the craft brewing industry. I got to stay in some very nice hotels, all because I was holding a boom mic. And I thought to myself, what does all this mean? Why do some people have like all this stuff? So when I was in um, the Hamptons, New York, I discovered Aventura Motors. Aventura Motors, a dealership where they sell Mercedes. And so me and the bus driver, who was like me, really didn't drink very much, hopped the fence and explored this lot full of Mercedes. And I got to see all these cars that I'd read about, like 300 SE cabriolets and 250 SLs. And, it was just a massive expanse of classic Mercedes, 111s, 113s, 109s, 108s. I mean, it was just amazing. They were all very nice cars, too. And I saw that and I was like, wow, I want to be like this one day. All these cars are coming to me. Aventura Motors is a dealership, by the way. But it was really amazing walking around in this lot full of cars at night, just looking. Probably not very smart. I could have gotten arrested. But I didn't know what to make of it. And the image stuck with me, after I came back. When I came back, we got a phone call, like the day I got back, the night I got back at 2 o'clock in the morning, we got a phone call from Lebanon that my uncle Pierre was terminally ill with cancer. And I guess if you smoke since age 11, that's what's going to happen to you. You're going to become terminally ill. After that, my dad became extremely depressed and his health took a turn for the worst. And that was when we found out that he had colon cancer and that, well, maybe not colon cancer. He had a hernia. That's what we knew. So he had the hernia operated on. The operation was not a success. He still did not have any bowel movements. And then after he was discharged from the hospital, his colon ruptured because of a tumor and he went into sepsis, and he sort of struggled through the next month in the ICU and eventually passed away because of massive cell death in his digestive system plus a massive blood infection. So we had to take him off life support. At this time, I was forced to acknowledge that I had relied too heavily on asking people questions. Eventually, when you become very good at something, there is nobody left to ask. Not that I'm saying I don't ask questions. I do ask questions, but I don't demand that the person I'm asking the questions of give me an answer. Why do we do that? Why do we ask people questions and expect them to have the answer for us all the time? I got two things out of this. One, I like to be able to help people. I like to be able to answer their questions when I have time. As of late, I have not had a lot of time to answer questions for people. But second of all, I realized that I had to stop acquiring knowledge from other people and start learning how to acquire knowledge through testing and analysis. Now, this was 2009 when my dad passed away. I found my favorite hobby in the whole world after this happened. At the time I started going to, I never stopped going to Catholic church. For all you Catholics out there, I never quit going to Mass, but I did do something a little different, which at the time, I just wanted some kind of community. So I started going to this young adult congregation called the Mezzanine in Merritt Island. And everybody there was strangely amused. They were amused by my weird indie folk songs I'd write. They were amused by my 220D that was falling apart. They were amused by the fact that I was uncharacteristically louder and bigger than everybody else. I don't know. But I made some friends there. I made friends with a guy named John Walling. John was older than me. He was a big guy. We were both kind of a little awkward, but I think John secretly was just like a genius. He was a very smart guy, and I loved being around him. Now John lives in China. I don't know what he's up to in China, but I guess he's having fun. Not doing anything stupid or crazy. He's got a very level head, but I think it's interesting that he eventually left the United States to go do something else. John and I would drive around Merritt Island hunting for mangoes. And that was my therapy. Before my dad had passed away, I had dropped an engine on my thumb. I don't know if you can see the scar, but I sliced my thumb open. And that was really like the last deep interaction I had with my dad, where he was bandaging my thumb up that was sliced down to the bone. And when he did that, I could feel his love for me, his closeness, his wondering, why is my son taking up this burden that I have, fixing Mercedes? Who knows? But it was one of those moments that I remember, because it was like that last time that I felt that loving touch from my dad before he got really sick and depressed. And then, we had some other interactions too when he was in the hospital. Not that I believe this about myself at all, because I don't. I'm not a great person. My dad would, when I would go see my dad in the hospital, he'd pat my head and he'd say, that he was proud of me, and he'd call me St. Pierre the mechanic, which I thought was his ridiculous nickname for me that I did not expect. He sort of looked at me, and I think he and I both had this understanding that it was the end for him, that at 76 years old or 74, however old he was, that was basically the end of the line. He was ready to go. He knew that he had something wrong with him that the doctors were not going to be able to find, and that was it. And I looked at my dad and I had this deep realization. I knew also it was like God revealed to me that it was the end of his life. And it was a very painful revelation for me. But I guess like the knowledge that he was going to die was like a secret between him and I that we both knew, that we didn't want to tell the rest of the family. I don't know, maybe my siblings knew it too. But that event changed everything for me. It changed everything for my family. My dad was no longer with us, although he still would, weird things would happen. He'd appear to me in dreams and help me solve problems and stuff like that. After he passed away and I discovered mango hunting during the summer and everything, I think my life took on a different turn, because my dad had always been a strict disciplinarian. And so without him there, I was both very angry, but I also felt very liberated. Like I didn't have anybody tying me down. I was still going through a lot of anguish though. So I got into another bad car accident. I was in a customer's 350 SL. I lost control of the car when I overbraked in a wet road because a semi had merged in front of me. And instead of slowing down, I slammed on the brakes and I lost control of the car and hit a tree at 55 miles an hour. So that was somewhat painful as well. But I felt really bad because this is a major failure for me. This was the second time that I'd gotten to an accident in a customer's car. And so I realized that something needed to change about the way I was managing my energy level, my driving and stuff like that. So I didn't have any substance use issues at the time. I didn't drink at the time. I didn't do anything weird at the time, but I did tend to go for long periods of time without enough sleep. So at that period of time, I said, I'm going to need to get more sleep, because this is why I'm cognitively deficient. As a 24-year-old, not getting enough sleep, I just could not possibly function the way I needed to. So now I try to make sure I get at least 7 hours of sleep every night. Because they say when you don't get enough sleep, it's like being drunk, and your ability to make decisions starts to wane when you don't get enough sleep. Anyway, this was basically like the first, 3 years of me servicing Mercedes. I'm going to do another live stream probably next weekend where, again, I'm doing this not so much for audience views, but because I want to document how I feel about my work and my career and my life at the 15-year mark of servicing these cars. Because not that I'm saying my life didn't exist before that, but I feel like my life really began when I started servicing these cars. Like that was when I found my calling. And oftentimes you don't realize what you have learned from your calling until you have experienced some time doing it. I think the thing that I've gotten most out of this work, by the way, for those of you that are still listening, is the knowledge that I have put a lot of dead Mercedes back on the road. Is this meaningful? It's just a car, right? Or is it? Because now we live in a time period where everything we buy, unless it's like a snap-on tool or something extremely expensive, is junk, or it's tied to a computer chip. Any functioning mechanical device is chipped. It's not mechanical anymore. And I think it's very important that we maintain a knowledge of mechanics. That's all. Okay, guys, so until next time, when we'll pick up in 2009 and 2010 and how I started to change the way that I would service cars. And of course, we're going to talk about the one and only Ben Oliver and how Ben came into my life and was an immense help to me and sort of jump-started my creativity process again. I will see you next time as I do these stream of consciousness live streams. Thank you.